The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, slipped beneath the door of the Ashford estate like a blade between ribs. Vivienne found it herself, still in her silk dressing gown, barefoot on the cold marble of the foyer. The paper trembled in her hands as she read the words that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her father, her family, and the fortune that bore their name. Charles Ashford, deceased. Stop heart failure, stop funeral arrangements pending, stop return home immediately. Stop. She did not cry. Not then. Vivienne Ashford had been raised in the tradition of old money. To show emotion was to show weakness, and weakness was a currency her father had never allowed her to spend. She folded the telegram carefully, placed it on the hallway table beside a vase of dying roses, and walked upstairs to dress in black. Her father had been in Chicago for 3 weeks, attending to what he called business matters. Vivienne had learned long ago not to ask questions about her father's business. Charles Ashford owned railroads, shipping lines, warehouses that stretched from New York to San Francisco. He was a man of empire, of handshakes in smoke-filled rooms, of ledgers that never quite balanced but always somehow showed profit. But now he was dead. And Vivienne, at 23 years old, was the sole heir to everything he had built. The funeral was held on a grey Thursday, beneath skies that threatened snow but delivered only cold wind. The Ashford family chapel was filled with men in dark suits and women in veils, their faces composed in practiced grief. Vivienne stood at the front, her hand resting on the polished mahogany casket, and watched them all with the detached curiosity of someone observing strangers. She recognized some of them, business associates of her father, lawyers, bankers, men whose names she had heard whispered in the library late at night when her father thought she was asleep. But there were others too, men who did not belong, men whose suits were too expensive, whose eyes were too watchful, whose presence felt like a threat wrapped in respectful silence. One man in particular caught her attention. He stood at the back of the chapel away from the other mourners, his hands folded in front of him. He was tall, perhaps 40, with dark hair slicked back and a face that could have been carved from stone. He did not look at the casket. He looked at Vivienne, and when their eyes met, he did not look away. After the service, as the mourners filed out into the cold afternoon, the man approached her. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, his footsteps barely audible on the chapel floor. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice low and smooth, "my condolences for your loss. Your father was a man of great vision." Vivienne regarded him coolly. "Thank you. And you are?" He smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "My name is Vincent Caruso. I was an associate of your father's. A business partner, you might say." "I see." She kept her voice neutral, her face a mask. "And what business did you have with my father, Mr. Caruso?" Vincent's smile widened slightly. "That, Miss Ashford, is a conversation best held in private. There are matters that require your immediate attention, matters that your father would have wanted you to understand." Vivienne felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "I am not interested in my father's business affairs, Mr. Caruso. I have lawyers and accountants to handle such things." Vincent shook his head slowly. "I'm afraid it is not that simple. Your father's debts do not wait for lawyers and accountants. They wait for you." "Debts?" Vivienne's voice sharpened. "My father was a wealthy man. What debts could he possibly owe?" Vincent's expression grew serious. "A great many, Miss Ashford, and all of them to people who do not accept excuses or delays." He reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed envelope, which he handed to her. "Inside, you will find the details. I suggest you read it tonight, alone. And then, if you are wise, you will call the number written at the bottom. The Don is a patient man, Miss Ashford, but his patience has limits." The Don. The word hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Vincent tipped his hat and turned to leave, his footsteps echoing in the empty chapel. Vivienne stood motionless, the envelope heavy in her hand, and felt the ground beneath her feet begin to crack. That night, alone in her father's study, Vivienne broke the seal and read the documents inside. What she found was not the inheritance of a wealthy man. It was the ledger of a man who had sold his soul, piece by piece, to men who traded in fear and blood. The Ashford fortune, she learned, was built on more than railroads and shipping. It was built on smuggling operations that ran liquor from Canada to New York during Prohibition. It was built on warehouses that stored goods stolen from rival gangs. It was built on bribes paid to judges, police captains, and politicians who looked the other way, while men like her father and Don Salvatore Moretti carved up the city between them. But the partnership had soured. Her father had tried to leave the business. to sever ties with the Moretti family, and in doing so, he had left behind debts. Debts that, according to the documents, amounted to nearly $2 million. Money owed not just in cash but in favors, in silence, in loyalty. And now those debts belonged to Vivienne. She sat in the leather chair behind her father's desk, the papers spread before her, and felt the weight of a world she had never known pressing down on her shoulders. She had been raised to attend charity galas and summer parties, to speak French and play the piano. She had never been taught how to negotiate with killers, but as she stared at the papers, at the names and numbers that represented lives bought and sold, Vivienne made a decision. She would not run. She would not hide. She would face the Don, pay the debts, and free her family from the shadow of the Moretti empire, even if it cost her everything. The next morning, Vivienne called the number Vincent Caruso had given her. A voice answered on the second ring, cold and clipped. "You wish to speak with the Don?" It was not a question. "Yes," Vivienne said. "My name is Vivienne Ashford. I believe he is expecting my call." There was a pause, then, "Be at the Palazzo Club tonight at 9 o'clock. Come alone. Do not be late." The line went dead. Vivienne set down the receiver and looked at herself in the mirror above the fireplace. She saw a young woman in mourning black, her blonde hair pinned back, her green eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She looked like someone who belonged in a ballroom, not a Mafia clubhouse. But appearances, she had learned, could be deceiving, and tonight she would need every ounce of the steel her father had never known she possessed. The Palazzo Club sat on the edge of the city, a 3-story building with red brick walls and windows that glowed with amber light. Outside, men in long coats stood smoking, their eyes tracking every car that passed. Vivienne arrived in her father's Rolls-Royce, driven by the family chauffeur, an old man named Thomas who had served the Ashfords for 30 years. As the car pulled up to the curb, Thomas turned to her, his weathered face creased with worry. "Miss Vivienne," he said quietly, "are you certain about this?" Vivienne met his gaze. "I am certain, Thomas. Wait here. If I am not out in 2 hours, go to the police." Thomas nodded, though they both knew the police would be of no use. Not in this part of town, not with men like Don Salvatore Moretti. Vivienne stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance. The men outside watched her approach, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a thick-necked soldier with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward and blocked her path. "State your business," he said. "My name is Vivienne Ashford. I have an appointment with the Don." The soldier's eyes narrowed. Then he nodded and pushed open the door. Inside, the interior of the Palazzo Club was a world unto itself. Red velvet curtains hung from the walls. A grand piano sat in the corner, playing soft, melancholy music. Men in tailored suits sat at tables, drinking whiskey and speaking in low voices. The air smelled of cigar smoke and expensive cologne. Vivienne was led through the main room and up a flight of stairs to a private office on the 3rd floor. The soldier knocked twice, then opened the door and gestured for her to enter. Inside, the office was dimly lit by a single lamp on a large oak desk. Behind the desk sat a man in his 50s, with silver hair and dark, penetrating eyes. He wore a black suit and a gold watch chain that glinted in the lamplight. His hands were folded on the desk and he did not rise as Vivienne entered. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice soft and measured. "Welcome. I am Don Salvatore Moretti. Please, sit." Vivienne sat in the chair across from him, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She met his gaze without flinching. The Don studied her for a long moment, as if weighing her worth. Then he spoke. "Your father was a complicated man, Miss Ashford. Ambitious, clever, but in the end foolish. He believed he could walk away from our arrangement without consequences. He was wrong." Vivienne kept her voice steady. "I am aware of my father's debts, Don Moretti. I'm here to discuss repayment." The Don's lips curved into a faint smile. "Repayment? An interesting word. Tell me, Miss Ashford, do you understand the nature of the debts your father owed?" "I have read the documents," Vivienne said. $2 million, plus interest." The Don nodded slowly. "And do you have $2 million, Miss Ashford?" Vivienne hesitated. "Not in cash, but I have assets, properties, stocks. I can liquidate them." The Don leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You are willing to sell everything your father built, to pay his debts? If that is what it takes to free my family from this arrangement, then yes." The Don regarded her with something that might have been respect or amusement. It was difficult to tell. "You are braver than your father, Miss Ashford, or perhaps more foolish, but I will accept your offer, under one condition." Vivienne's heart pounded, but she kept her expression calm. What condition? The Don leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. You will sell your assets. You will pay the debt. But you will also swear an oath of silence. You will never speak of what your father did. You will never speak of our arrangement. And you will never, under any circumstances, betray the trust I am placing in you by allowing you to walk out of this room tonight. Vivienne felt the weight of his words settle over her like a shroud. And if I refuse? The Don's smile faded. Then you will not walk out of this room at all. Silence filled the office, thick and suffocating. Vivienne knew she had no choice. She had walked into the lion's den, and the only way out was to agree to the lion's terms. I accept, she said quietly. The Don nodded. Good. Vincent will handle the details. You have 6 months to liquidate your assets and deliver the payment. Do not disappoint me, Miss Ashford. I do not give second chances. Vivienne rose from her chair, her legs unsteady but her resolve firm. She turned toward the door, but the Don's voice stopped her. One more thing, Miss Ashford. She turned back. The Don's eyes glittered in the lamplight. Your father thought he could escape his past. He was wrong. Do not make the same mistake. Vivienne said nothing. She walked out of the office, down the stairs, and out into the cold night air. Thomas was waiting by the car, his face etched with relief. As the Rolls-Royce pulled away from the Palazzo Club, Vivienne stared out the window at the city lights blurring past. She had made a deal with the devil, and now she would have to find a way to survive it. But deep in her heart, Vivienne knew one truth that the Don did not. She was not her father, and she would not go quietly into the shadows. The winter of 1931 came early to New York, bringing with it snow that turned the city into a landscape of white and grey. Vivienne Ashford spent those cold months dismantling everything her father had built, piece by piece, brick by brick, until the Ashford empire was nothing but a memory written in legal documents and bank transfers. She sold the railroads first, 3 lines that ran from New York to Chicago, sold to a consortium of businessmen who asked no questions and paid in cash. Then came the shipping company, the warehouses, the properties scattered across 5 states. Each sale was negotiated in cold boardrooms, with lawyers who spoke in careful euphemisms and bankers who averted their eyes when she signed the papers. The Ashford mansion was the last to go, the house where Vivienne had been born, where she had learned to walk and speak and play the piano, where her mother had died of influenza when Vivienne was 12, leaving behind only photographs and the scent of lavender that still lingered in the upstairs hallways. Vivienne stood in the empty ballroom on the day the new owners took possession, her footsteps echoing on the parquet floor. She remembered the parties her parents had thrown here, the music and laughter, the women in silk gowns and men in white ties. She remembered her father dancing with her mother, their faces lit by candlelight, and how happy they had seemed. It had all been a lie. Vincent Caruso came to oversee the transactions. He arrived at the mansion on a Tuesday afternoon in December, accompanied by 2 soldiers who waited by the car while he inspected the property. Vivienne met him in the library, where the shelves had already been emptied and the furniture covered in white sheets. Everything is in order, Vincent said, flipping through the documents she had prepared. The properties have been sold. The accounts have been closed. You have done well, Miss Ashford. Vivienne kept her voice neutral. And the debt? Vincent set down the papers and looked at her. $1,800,000. You are still short $200,000. Vivienne felt her stomach tighten. That is everything I have, Mr. Caruso. There is nothing left. Vincent's expression did not change. Then you have a problem, Miss Ashford. The Don does not accept partial payment. What would you have me do? Vivienne's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. I have sold everything. The house, the businesses, my mother's jewelry. There is nothing more to sell. Vincent walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered grounds. There is always something more, Miss Ashford. You simply have to be willing to find it. Vivienne stared at him, her mind racing. And if I cannot? Vincent turned back to her, his dark eyes unreadable. Then the Don will collect his debt in other ways. Ways that you will not enjoy. The threat hung in the air between them, cold and final. Vivienne knew what he meant. She had heard the stories, whispered in the society pages and hinted at in newspaper articles that never quite told the whole truth. People who owed the Moretti family did not simply lose their money. They lost their lives. I need more time, Vivienne said quietly. Vincent shook his head. You have had 6 months, Miss Ashford. Time is a luxury you no longer possess. Then what do you suggest? Vincent studied her for a long moment, as if weighing a decision. Then he spoke, his voice low. There is one option. but it requires trust and a willingness to do things that a woman of your background might find distasteful. Vivienne met his gaze. I am listening. The Don has business associates who are interested in certain information. Information about your father's connections, names, locations, details of transactions that were never recorded in the official ledgers. You want me to betray my father's associates, Vivienne said flatly. I want you to tell the truth, Vincent replied. Your father kept secrets, Miss Ashford. Secrets that are valuable to the right people. If you provide those secrets, the Don may be willing to forgive the remaining debt. Vivienne felt a wave of nausea. My father is dead. What good does it do to ruin the lives of the men he worked with? Vincent's smile was cold. Those men are not innocent, Miss Ashford. They are criminals, smugglers, murderers. They used your father just as your father used them. Do not waste your sympathy on people who would not waste theirs on you. Vivienne turned away, her hands trembling. She had spent 6 months trying to escape the shadow of her father's crimes, only to be asked to sink deeper into the darkness. But what choice did she have? I need to think about it, she said finally. Vincent nodded. You have until the end of the week. After that, the Don will make his own arrangements. He left without another word, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Vivienne stood alone in the library, surrounded by empty shelves and covered furniture, and felt the walls closing in. That night, Vivienne could not sleep. She lay in bed in the small apartment she had rented after selling the mansion, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Vincent's offer. She thought about her father, about the man she had believed him to be, and the man he had actually been. She thought about the lives that had been destroyed by his ambition, the families torn apart, the blood spilled in the name of profit, and she thought about her own survival. In the morning, she made her decision. She called Vincent and told him she would provide the information the Don wanted, but she had one condition. She wanted to meet with the Don himself, face to face, to ensure that her debt would be forgiven completely, with no hidden clauses or future obligations. Vincent agreed. The meeting was set for Friday night at the Palazzo Club. Vivienne arrived at 9 o'clock, just as she had the first time. The club was crowded with men drinking and gambling, the air thick with smoke and laughter. She was led upstairs to the Don's office, where Salvatore Moretti sat behind his desk, a glass of wine in his hand. Miss Ashford, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Vincent tells me you have reconsidered my offer. Vivienne sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. I have. I will provide the information you want, but I need your word that my debt will be forgiven, completely. No further obligations, no ties to your organization. The Don took a sip of wine, his eyes never leaving hers. You ask for much, Miss Ashford. Trust is not something I give lightly. And yet you are asking me to trust you, Vivienne replied. You are asking me to betray men my father called friends, men who may come looking for revenge if they learn what I have done. I need assurance that I will be protected. The Don set down his glass and leaned forward. Very well, you have my word. Provide the information and your debt will be forgiven. You will be free of the Moretti family. But understand this, Miss Ashford. If you betray me, if you go to the police or speak of this arrangement to anyone, there will be no place on this earth where you can hide. Do we have an understanding? Vivienne nodded. We do. Good. Then let us begin. Over the next 2 hours, Vivienne told the Don everything she knew. She named the judges her father had bribed, the police captains who had looked the other way, the politicians who had taken money to smooth the path for illegal shipments. She described the warehouses where stolen goods were stored, the routes used to smuggle liquor from Canada, the payoffs made to rival gangs to avoid bloodshed. She spoke in a calm, steady voice, her emotions locked away behind a wall of ice. She did not think about the consequences of her words. She did not think about the lives that would be ruined, the arrests that would follow, the violence that would erupt as the Don used her information to tighten his grip on the city. She thought only of freedom, of walking out of the Palazzo Club and never looking back. When she finished, the Don sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You have been very thorough, Miss Ashford. More thorough than I expected. I keep my promises, Vivienne said. As do I. The Don opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a document, which he slid across to her. This is a letter of release, signed and witnessed. Your debt is paid. You are free. Vivienne took the document and read it carefully. It was exactly as he had promised. A legal release from all obligations to the Moretti family. She folded it and placed it in her purse, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Thank you, she said quietly. The Don rose from his chair and walked around the desk. He stood before her, his expression unreadable. "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Ashford. Your father was weak, but you have strength. I respect that." Vivienne met his gaze. "I hope I never see you again, Don Moretti." The Don smiled faintly. "As do I, Miss Ashford, as do I." Vivienne walked out of the office, down the stairs, and out into the cold night. Thomas was waiting by the car, and she climbed into the back seat without a word. As the Rolls-Royce pulled away from the Palazzo Club, she looked back at the glowing windows and felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She was free. The debt was paid. The Ashford name, tarnished though it was, would survive. But freedom, Vivienne would soon learn, came with a price of its own. The following week, the newspapers exploded with headlines. Federal agents raided warehouses across the city, seizing shipments of illegal liquor and arresting dozens of men connected to smuggling operations. Judges were investigated, police captains were suspended, politicians resigned in disgrace, and in the shadows men began to die. A shipping magnate was found shot in his car outside a restaurant in Queens. A warehouse owner disappeared, his body washing up in the East River 3 days later. A lawyer who had represented several of her father's associates was killed in his office, the door left open, and the safe emptied. Vivienne read the reports with a sick sense of dread. She had known there would be consequences, but she had not imagined the scale of the violence her information would unleash. She tried to tell herself it was not her fault, that these men were criminals who had chosen their path, that she had only done what was necessary to survive. But late at night, alone in her apartment, she could not escape the guilt that gnawed at her heart. And then, 2 weeks after her meeting with the Don, Vincent Caruso appeared at her door. Vivienne opened it to find him standing in the hallway, his expression grim. "We need to talk," he said. She let him in, her heart pounding. "What is it?" Vincent closed the door behind him and turned to face her. "You have a problem, Miss Ashford. The men you named are starting to figure out where the information came from, and they are not happy." Vivienne felt her blood run cold. "But the Don promised me protection." "The Don can protect you from many things," Vincent said, "but he cannot protect you from men who want revenge. These are dangerous people, Miss Ashford, and they are coming for you. What am I supposed to do?" Vivienne's voice rose in panic. "I did what the Don asked. I kept my end of the bargain." Vincent stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. "You need to leave the city. Tonight. Go somewhere far away, somewhere they cannot find you. The Don has arranged for a car to take you to the train station. You will have enough money to start over, but you must go now." Vivienne stared at him, her mind reeling. This was not how it was supposed to end. She was supposed to be free, safe, not running for her life in the middle of the night. "Where am I supposed to go?" she whispered. Vincent handed her an envelope. Inside are train tickets and a new identity. "Clara Westfield. You will take the train to Boston, then a ship to Europe. In 6 months, when things have quieted down, you can return. But for now, you must disappear." Vivienne took the envelope, her hands shaking. "And if I refuse?" Vincent's expression was grim. "Then you will be dead by morning." Vivienne packed a single suitcase, taking only what she could carry. She left everything else behind. The furniture, the photographs, the last remnants of the life she had known. Thomas drove her to the train station, his face creased with worry. "Where will you go, Miss Vivienne?" he asked as they pulled up to the platform. Vivienne looked out at the snow falling softly in the streetlights. "I do not know, Thomas. Somewhere far from here." Thomas reached into his coat and withdrew a small revolver, which he pressed into her hand. "Take this, just in case." Vivienne stared at the weapon, cold and heavy in her palm. Then she nodded and slipped it into her purse. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." The old man's eyes glistened. "Be safe, Miss Vivienne." Vivienne boarded the train just before midnight, her suitcase clutched in one hand, her new identity papers in the other. She found a seat in an empty compartment and watched as the city lights faded into the darkness. She was free, but freedom, she realized, was just another kind of prison. And somewhere in the shadows, the men she had betrayed were already hunting her. The train rattled through the darkness, carrying Vivienne away from New York and into a future that felt as uncertain as the shadows racing past the window. She sat alone in her compartment, the revolver Thomas had given her resting heavy in her purse, and tried not to think about the life she was leaving behind. Clara Westfield, that was her name now. A woman with no history, no family, no ties to the Ashford Empire or the debts that had consumed it. She repeated the name silently to herself, trying to make it feel real, but it remained foreign on her tongue, a costume that did not quite fit. The train reached Boston by dawn. Vivienne disembarked into a grey morning, the air sharp with salt and cold. She had never been to Boston before, had never needed to travel beyond the carefully curated world of New York society. Now she stood on a platform surrounded by strangers, clutching a suitcase that held everything she owned, and felt utterly alone. According to Vincent's instructions, she was to board a ship to Liverpool in 3 days. Until then, she would stay at a modest hotel near the harbour, keeping to herself and avoiding attention. She followed the plan mechanically, checking into the hotel under her false name, locking the door behind her, and sitting on the edge of the narrow bed with her head in her hands. She had escaped. But at what cost? The days in Boston passed slowly. Vivienne spent her time walking along the harbour, watching ships come and go, their horns echoing across the water. She tried to imagine herself boarding one of those vessels, sailing away to Europe, starting over in a place where no one knew her name or her sins. But the guilt followed her like a shadow. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the men she had betrayed, the judges, the police captains, the businessmen who had trusted her father and had been destroyed by her words. She told herself they were criminals, that they deserved their fate, but the justification felt hollow. On the third day, as Vivienne prepared to leave for the docks, someone knocked on her hotel room door. She froze, her heart pounding. No one knew she was here. Vincent had assured her the arrangements were secret, that her location would be safe until she boarded the ship. The knock came again, soft but insistent. Vivienne crossed to the door and looked through the peephole. A woman stood in the hallway, dressed in a dark coat and hat, her face partially obscured by a veil. She was alone. Vivienne hesitated, then opened the door a crack, keeping the chain lock in place. "Yes?" The woman lifted her veil, revealing a pale, elegant face with dark eyes and sharp cheekbones. Vivienne recognized her immediately. Clara Moretti, the Don's wife. "Miss Ashford," Clara said quietly, her voice soft but edged with steel. "We need to talk." Vivienne's hand moved instinctively to the purse where she kept the revolver. "How did you find me?" Clara's lips curved into a faint smile. "The Moretti family has eyes everywhere, Miss Ashford. Did you really think you could disappear so easily?" Vivienne felt her stomach twist. "What do you want?" "To help you," Clara said simply. "May I come in?" Vivienne studied the woman's face, searching for signs of deception, but Clara's expression was calm, almost sympathetic. Against her better judgment, Vivienne unlatched the chain and opened the door. Clara entered the room, glancing around at the sparse furnishings before turning back to Vivienne. "You are making a mistake," she said. "Running to Europe will not save you." Vivienne closed the door and crossed her arms. "Your husband gave me no choice. He said men were coming for me." "My husband," Clara said carefully, "is many things, but he is not always truthful, especially when it serves his purposes." Vivienne frowned. "What are you talking about?" Clara removed her gloves and sat in the chair by the window. "Tell me, Miss Ashford, do you know why my husband wanted the information you provided?" "To consolidate his power," Vivienne said. "To eliminate rivals." Clara nodded slowly. "That is part of it, but there is more. My husband is not content with controlling the smuggling operations in New York. He wants to expand, to take over territories held by other families. The men you named were not just your father's associates. They were obstacles, men who stood in my husband's way." Vivienne felt a chill run through her. "So he used me?" "Yes," Clara said. "He used you, just as he uses everyone. And now that you have served your purpose, he wants you gone, out of the country, out of sight, so that you cannot speak of what you know. But I gave him everything," Vivienne said, her voice rising. "I betrayed everyone my father knew. What more could he possibly want from me?" Clara's eyes darkened. "Silence, Miss Ashford, permanent silence, the kind that can only be guaranteed by a grave." Vivienne stared at her, the weight of the words sinking in. "You are saying he plans to have me killed?" "I am saying that my husband does not leave loose ends," Clara replied. "And you, Miss Ashford, are a very dangerous loose end." Vivienne sank onto the bed, her mind racing. "Then why are you here? Why warn me?" Clara stood and walked to the window, looking out at the harbour. "Because I am tired, Miss Ashford, tired of watching my husband destroy lives, tired of pretending I do not see the blood on his hands, and tired of being powerless to stop him." She turned back to Vivienne, her expression hard. "My husband took everything from me, my freedom, my dignity, my son." Vivienne looked up sharply. "Your son?" Clara's voice grew quiet, almost fragile. "His name was Marco. He was 17, bright, kind, nothing like his father. He wanted to go to college to study medicine, but my husband had other plans. He wanted Marco to join the family business, to become a soldier, a killer. Clara paused, her hands trembling. Marco refused, and one night he disappeared. My husband told me he had run away, that he would return when he came to his senses. But I know the truth. I have always known. Vivienne felt a surge of horror. Your husband killed your own son. Not directly, Clara said bitterly, but he gave the order, and his men carried it out, because Marco was a weakness, a liability, and my husband does not tolerate weakness. Vivienne's throat tightened. I am sorry. Clara's eyes glistened, but she did not cry. Sorrow is a luxury I cannot afford, Miss Ashford, but vengeance is not. I have spent the last 5 years planning, waiting, gathering information, and now I have an opportunity. But I cannot do it alone. Vivienne met her gaze. What are you asking me to do? Clara crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed. My husband trusts you, in his own way. He believes you are broken, afraid, that you will do whatever he tells you to ensure your survival, and that is your advantage. I do not understand. Clara leaned closer, her voice low and urgent. Do not get on that ship, Miss Ashford. Return to New York. Tell my husband you have reconsidered, that you are willing to work for him. Gain his trust, and when the time is right, help me destroy him. Vivienne shook her head. You are asking me to walk back into the lion's den. Why would I do that? Because if you do not, Clara said coldly, you will spend the rest of your life running, and eventually my husband's men will find you. They always do. The two women sat in silence, the weight of the choice hanging between them. Vivienne thought about the train that had brought her here, about the ship waiting in the harbor, about the life she had hoped to rebuild in Europe. But Clara was right. Running would not save her. It would only delay the inevitable. What is your plan? Vivienne asked finally. Clara smiled, a cold, predatory expression. Christmas Eve. My husband is hosting a feast at the mansion. All the capos, the underbosses, the consiglières will be there. It is a tradition, a show of power. And it will be the perfect opportunity to strike. Strike how? Clara's smile widened. That, Miss Ashford, is what we need to figure out together. Vivienne returned to New York 2 days later, stepping off the train into a city blanketed in fresh snow. She did not go to her apartment. Instead, she went directly to the Palazzo Club and asked to see the Don. Vincent Caruso met her at the door, his expression a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Miss Ashford, you were supposed to be on a ship to Europe. I changed my mind, Vivienne said calmly. I want to speak with the Don. Vincent studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Wait here. 10 minutes later, Vivienne was escorted to the Don's office. Salvatore Moretti sat behind his desk, a glass of wine in his hand, his expression unreadable. Miss Ashford, he said slowly, this is unexpected. Vivienne sat in the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap. I have been thinking, Don Moretti, about my situation, about my future. The Don raised an eyebrow. Go on. I realize now that running is not the answer, Vivienne said. I have no family, no fortune, no place in the world I once knew, but I do have one thing of value, information, connections, skills that could be useful to you. The Don leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. What are you proposing? That I work for you, Vivienne said, not as a debtor, but as an asset. I know people in society, people who would never speak to men like Vincent Caruso or your soldiers. I can gain access to places you cannot. I can be useful. The Don studied her, his expression thoughtful. And what do you want in return? Protection, Vivienne said. A place to live, a purpose. I do not want to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. The Don sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. You surprise me, Miss Ashford. Most people in your position would beg for mercy, but you are asking for a job. I'm a practical woman, Don Moretti, and I know that loyalty is more valuable than fear. The Don smiled faintly. Very well. You will stay in New York. You will work for me. But understand this. If you betray me again, there will be no second chances. Do we have an understanding? Vivienne nodded. We do. Good. Then welcome to the family, Miss Ashford. Vivienne left the Palazzo Club and walked out into the cold night, her breath misting in the air. She had done it. She had walked back into the lion's den, and now, with Clara Moretti's help, she would find a way to destroy the lion himself. But as she climbed into a waiting car, Vivienne could not shake the feeling that she had just made a deal with forces far darker than she understood. and that the cost of vengeance might be more than she was willing to pay. Over the following weeks, Vivienne became a fixture in the Moretti organization. She attended meetings with the Don, sat in on negotiations, and used her social connections to gather information. She played the role of the loyal servant perfectly, never questioning orders, never showing doubt. And in secret she met with Clara Moretti. They met in quiet places, a church on the outskirts of the city, a cafe that closed early, a park where no one walked in winter, and there they planned. Clara had been gathering intelligence for years. She knew the layout of the Moretti mansion, the schedules of the guards, the routines of the soldiers. She knew where the Don kept his private records, where he stored his weapons, where he felt safest, and she knew his greatest weakness. Every Christmas Eve, the Don hosted a feast for his inner circle. It was a tradition that went back decades, a night when the family gathered to celebrate their power and their unity. The mansion would be filled with food and wine, with music and laughter, and the Don would sit at the head of the table, surrounded by the men who owed him everything. It was the one night of the year when his guard was down. "That is when we strike," Clara said. "When he is surrounded by his capos and underbosses, when he believes himself untouchable. That is when we will take everything from him." Vivienne listened, her heart pounding. "And how do we do that?" Clara's smile was cold. "Poison, Miss Ashford. Slow and subtle, mixed into the wine. By the time he realizes what is happening, it will be too late." Vivienne felt a chill run through her. "You want to kill him. I want justice," Clara said. "For my son, for all the lives he has destroyed. And you are going to help me." Vivienne stared at the older woman, seeing the steel in her eyes. The years of pain and rage coiled beneath her elegant exterior. And in that moment, Vivienne understood. This was not just about revenge. It was about freedom, for both of them. "I will help you," Vivienne said quietly, "but we have to be careful. If anyone suspects—" "No one will suspect," Clara interrupted, "because you are going to be the one to serve the wine." Vivienne's blood ran cold. "What?" "You are the Don's newest asset," Clara said, "his pet project. He trusts you, or at least he believes he does. If you serve the wine, no one will question it, and when he dies, they will blame each other. The capos, the underbosses. They will turn on one another, and in the chaos we will disappear." Vivienne felt the weight of the plan settle over her. It was brilliant, dangerous, and utterly insane, but it was their only chance. "All right," Vivienne said. "I will do it." Clara reached across the table and took her hand, her grip firm. "Then we are agreed. On Christmas Eve, we end this." As Vivienne walked home through the snowy streets, she thought about the path that had brought her here. From heiress to debtor to assassin, she had lost everything, her fortune, her name, her innocence, but she had gained something too, a purpose, a resolve, and a partner in vengeance who understood the cost of survival. Christmas Eve was 3 weeks away, and when it came, the Moretti Empire would fall, or Vivienne Ashford would die trying. The days leading up to Christmas Eve passed in a blur of preparation and dread. Vivienne moved through the Moretti organization like a ghost, attending meetings, gathering information, and playing the role of the loyal servant with a precision that would have impressed her father. But beneath the careful facade, her mind was a storm of fear and calculation. Clara Moretti provided the poison, a vial no larger than a perfume bottle, filled with a clear liquid that had no smell and no taste. It was extracted from oleander, Clara explained, a plant as beautiful as it was deadly. Mixed into wine, it would take effect slowly, allowing the victim time to finish the meal before the symptoms began. First would come nausea, then confusion, then paralysis, and finally the heart would stop. "It will look like a heart attack," Clara said as she pressed the vial into Vivienne's hand. "Natural causes. No one will suspect poison, and by the time they think to test the wine, we will be gone." Vivienne held the vial up to the light, watching the liquid shift inside the glass. "How did you get this?" Clara's smile was bitter. "I have been planning this for 5 years, Miss Ashford. I have had time to prepare." The Moretti mansion sat on a hill overlooking the Hudson River, a sprawling estate of stone and wrought iron that spoke of old money and older sins. Vivienne had been there only once before, for a meeting with the Don and his underboss, a thick-necked man named Salvatore De Luca, who watched her with the cold eyes of a predator sizing up prey. Now, as the car carrying Vivienne pulled through the gates on Christmas Eve, she felt her stomach twist with fear. The mansion was ablaze with light, every window glowing golden in the darkness. Snow covered the grounds, pristine and untouched, as if the world outside did not exist. Inside, the mansion was a palace of wealth and violence. The entrance hall was dominated by a grand staircase, its banister carved from dark mahogany. Oil paintings of men in military uniforms lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow Vivienne as she walked past. The air smelled of roasting meat and expensive cigars, and from somewhere deeper in the house came the sound of music and laughter. Vincent Caruso met her at the door. "Miss Ashford?" he said, his tone neutral but his eyes watchful. "The Don is pleased you could attend." "I would not miss it," Vivienne replied, keeping her voice steady. Vincent led her through the mansion to the dining room, a vast chamber with a table that could seat 30. The table was already set with fine china and crystal glasses, and at the center sat a roasted boar, its skin glistening with honey and herbs. Candles flickered in silver candelabras, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The guests were already arriving. Vivienne recognized some of them from her time working for the Don. There was De Luca, the underboss, his face flushed with wine and good humor. There was Antonio Ricci, the consigliere, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for cruelty masked by courtesy. There were capos and soldiers, men whose names she had learned to remember and whose faces she had learned to read. And at the head of the table sat Don Salvatore Moretti himself, dressed in a black suit and a silk tie, his silver hair gleaming in the candlelight. He looked every inch the patriarch, the king of his domain, the man who held life and death in the palm of his hand. Beside him, in a chair that seemed almost too grand for her slight frame, sat Clara Moretti. She wore a gown of deep crimson, her dark hair swept up in an elegant chignon, her face a mask of serene composure. When her eyes met Vivienne's, there was no acknowledgement, no sign of their secret alliance, only the faintest flicker of something that might have been fear or anticipation. "Miss Ashford," the Don said, gesturing to an empty seat near the middle of the table. "Come, sit. Tonight we celebrate family, and you are part of this family now." Vivienne took her seat, her pulse racing. The vial of poison was hidden in a small pocket, sewn into the lining of her dress, pressing against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She had rehearsed the plan 100 times in her mind. Wait until the meal was served. Volunteer to pour the wine. Add the poison to the Don's glass when no one was looking, and then disappear into the chaos that would follow. It seemed so simple and so impossibly dangerous. The feast began with toasts. The Don raised his glass and spoke of loyalty, of family, of the bonds that tied them together in a world that sought to tear them apart. The men around the table raised their glasses in response, their voices loud and fervent. Vivienne raised her own glass, her hand steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "To family," the Don said, his eyes sweeping across the table, "and to those who honor it." "To family," the men echoed. The first course was served. Oysters on ice, drizzled with lemon and vinegar. Vivienne ate mechanically, tasting nothing, her attention fixed on the Don. He was in high spirits, laughing and joking with the men around him, his hand resting on Clara's shoulder in a gesture of casual possession. Clara, for her part, played the dutiful wife perfectly. She smiled when he spoke, laughed when he joked, and said nothing that would draw attention. But Vivienne could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the stem of her wine glass just a little too tightly. The second course arrived. Pasta in a rich cream sauce, topped with shavings of truffle. The room filled with the sounds of eating and conversation, the men growing louder as the wine flowed. Vivienne watched as soldiers moved through the room, refilling glasses and clearing plates. She needed to find a way to pour the wine herself. But how? The answer came from an unexpected source. "Miss Ashford," the Don said, raising his voice to be heard over the din, "you have done well these past weeks. Your loyalty has been noted. As a token of my appreciation, I would like you to serve the wine for the next course." Vivienne's heart stopped. She had not expected the Don to offer her the opportunity so openly, so publicly, but here it was, the moment she had been waiting for. She forced herself to smile, to incline her head graciously. "It would be my honor, Don Moretti." Vincent brought her a silver tray with a crystal decanter and a dozen glasses. Vivienne took the tray, her hands trembling slightly, and began to pour. She moved around the table, filling each glass with the deep red wine, her movements slow and deliberate. She smiled at the men as she served them, accepting their thanks with a nod, all the while feeling the weight of the vial hidden in her dress. When she reached the Don's seat, she paused. He was turned away, speaking to De Luca in low tones, his back to her. Clara sat across from him, her eyes locked on Vivienne's, her expression unreadable. This was it, the moment. Vivienne's hand moved to the pocket in her dress, her fingers closing around the vial. She pulled it free, shielding it with the tray, and with a quick, practiced motion, she tipped the contents into the Don's glass. The poison mixed seamlessly with the wine, invisible and odorless. Vivienne capped the vial and slipped it back into her pocket, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. She set the glass before the Don and stepped back, her face a mask of calm. "Thank you, Miss Ashford," the Don said, turning back to the table. "You are most gracious." Vivienne returned to her seat, her legs weak, her hands cold. It was done. The poison was in the Don's glass. All that remained was to wait. The third course was served. Roasted boar, carved at the table by one of the soldiers, the meat tender and rich. The Don raised his glass, and the men around the table did the same. "To prosperity," the Don said, "and to those who earn it." He drank deeply. Vivienne watched, her breath caught in her throat. The Don set down his glass and took a bite of meat, chewing slowly, savoring the flavor. He showed no sign of distress, no indication that anything was wrong. Minutes passed. The conversation continued. The men ate and drank, their voices growing louder, their laughter more raucous, and the Don sat at the head of the table, alive and well, his face flushed with wine and satisfaction. Vivienne's hands clenched in her lap. Why was nothing happening? Clara had said the poison would act quickly, but the Don seemed fine. More than fine. He was thriving. She glanced at Clara, whose face had gone pale. Their eyes met across the table, and Vivienne saw the same question mirrored in the older woman's gaze. What had gone wrong? The fourth course arrived, a selection of cheeses and fruits, arranged on silver platters. The Don helped himself, piling food onto his plate with the appetite of a man who had not a care in the world. Vivienne felt panic rising in her chest. If the poison did not work, they were finished. The Don would discover the plot, and they would both die. And then, as the Don reached for another piece of cheese, he paused. His hand hovered in the air, trembling slightly. His face, so flushed a moment before, had gone ashen. "Don Moretti?" De Luca said, leaning forward. "Are you all right?" The Don opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His hand fell to the table, knocking over his wineglass. Red liquid spilled across the white tablecloth like blood. "Don!" Vincent was on his feet, moving toward the head of the table. "Someone call a doctor." But it was too late. The Don's body convulsed, his hands clawing at his throat, his eyes bulged, wide and unseeing, and a terrible wheezing sound escaped his lips. The men around the table scrambled to their feet, shouting orders, calling for help, but there was nothing they could do. Salvatore Moretti, the Don of the Moretti family, the man who had ruled New York's underworld with an iron fist, collapsed forward onto the table, his face landing in a platter of fruit. He did not move again. The room erupted into chaos. Soldiers rushed forward, some trying to revive the Don, others shouting accusations, demanding to know what had happened. Vivienne sat frozen in her chair, her mind blank with shock. It had worked. The poison had worked. The Don was dead. And then, through the chaos, she heard Clara's voice, sharp and commanding. "Enough." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Clara Moretti, who stood at the head of the table, her crimson gown stark against the darkness of the room. Her face was pale but composed, her hands folded in front of her. "My husband is dead," she said, her voice steady, "and we will mourn him. But first we will find out who is responsible." She turned her gaze to Vincent, who stood beside the Don's body, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. "Seal the house," Clara ordered. "No one leaves until we know what happened here." Vincent hesitated, then nodded. "You heard her. Lock the doors. No one gets out." Vivienne felt her blood run cold. This was not part of the plan. They were supposed to disappear in the chaos, to slip away before anyone thought to question them. But Clara had sealed the mansion, trapped them all inside. What was she doing? The soldiers moved through the room, herding the guests into the parlor adjacent to the dining room. Vivienne found herself pressed between two capos, their faces hard and suspicious. She searched the crowd for Clara, but the older woman was nowhere to be seen. Minutes stretched into an hour. The guests sat in tense silence, their eyes darting from one to another, each man wondering if he was sitting next to a traitor. Vivienne's mind raced. She needed to find Clara, to get out of the mansion before someone started asking questions about the wine. But she was trapped. just like everyone else. And then Vincent Caruso entered the parlor, his face grim. He held something in his hand, a crystal decanter, half empty, the wine inside gleaming darkly in the lamplight. "We found this in the dining room," Vincent said, his voice cold. "The wine the Don drank, it has been tested. There is poison in it." A murmur ran through the room. Men shifted in their seats, their hands moving toward concealed weapons. Vivienne felt her heart hammering in her chest. Vincent's eyes swept across the crowd. Someone in this room killed the Don, and they will pay for it with their life. His gaze landed on Vivienne. She felt the weight of it like a physical blow. "Miss Ashford," Vincent said slowly, "you poured the wine tonight. Did you not?" Vivienne's throat closed. Every eye in the room turned to her. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny it, to say something that would save her, but no words came. And then, from the doorway, Clara Moretti's voice rang out. It was not her. The room fell silent. Clara stepped into the parlor, her face pale, but her voice strong. "It was me. I poisoned the wine. I killed my husband." The men stared at her, shock written across their faces. Vincent took a step forward, his hand moving to the gun at his belt. "Mrs. Moretti," he said slowly, "what are you saying?" Clara walked to the center of the room, her head held high. "I am saying that I killed Salvatore Moretti for what he did to our son, for the years of cruelty and betrayal, for every life he destroyed in the name of power." She turned to face the men, her eyes blazing. "And I would do it again." For a long moment no one moved. Then Vincent drew his gun and leveled it at Clara's chest. "You have confessed to murdering the Don," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "The penalty is death." Clara did not flinch. "Then shoot me, Vincent. But know this. I am not the only one who wanted him dead. Look around this room. Look at the men who called him Don. How many of them hated him? How many of them wished for his death, but were too afraid to act?" Vincent's hand trembled, but he did not pull the trigger. Clara smiled, a cold, bitter expression. "You cannot kill me, Vincent, because if you do, this family will tear itself apart. The capos will fight for control. The underbosses will scheme and betray, and everything Salvatore built will crumble to dust." She turned to the assembled men. "But if you let me live, if you accept my confession and allow me to leave, I will take my secrets to the grave, the names of the traitors, the locations of the hidden accounts. Everything I know will die with me, and you can rebuild, without bloodshed, without war." The room was silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. And then, slowly, Antonio Ricci, the consigliere, rose from his seat. "She speaks the truth," Ricci said quietly. "If we kill her, we lose everything, but if we let her go, we survive." Vincent stared at him, disbelief etched across his face. "You cannot be serious." Ricci met his gaze. "I am always serious, Vincent. And I'm telling you, this is the only way." One by one, the men in the room nodded, not in agreement perhaps, but in resignation. They understood the reality of the situation. Clara Moretti held the keys to the kingdom, and if they wanted to keep it, they had to let her walk away. Vincent lowered his gun, his jaw clenched. "Go," he said finally, "before I change my mind." Clara turned and walked toward the door. As she passed Vivienne, she reached out and took her hand, squeezing it once. Then she was gone, disappearing into the snowy night. Vivienne sat in stunned silence, her mind reeling. Clara had confessed. She had taken the blame, sacrificed herself to save Vivienne, and the men had let her go. But why? The answer came later, when Vincent Caruso pulled Vivienne aside. "You are free to go, Miss Ashford," he said, his voice cold, "but do not return to this house, and do not speak of what happened here tonight." Vivienne nodded, her voice caught in her throat. As she walked out into the cold December air, the snow falling softly around her, Vivienne understood. Clara had not just confessed to save Vivienne's life. She had confessed to destroy the Moretti family from within. By admitting her guilt, she had planted the seeds of doubt and suspicion among the men. They would turn on each other, fighting for power, tearing the organization apart. And in the chaos, Clara Moretti would vanish, taking with her the secrets that could rebuild or destroy them all. Vivienne climbed into a waiting car and watched the mansion recede into the darkness. The Don was dead. Clara was gone, and Vivienne Ashford, the heiress who had sold her fortune to free her family, had survived. But as the car drove through the snowy streets of New York, Vivienne could not shake the feeling that the story was not yet over, and that the winter of 1931 had only just begun. The city changed after the death of Don Salvatore Moretti. It was not an obvious change, not something you could see in the streets or read in the newspapers, but those who moved in the shadows felt it. A shift in power, a fracture in the foundation of the underworld. The Moretti family did not collapse immediately. Vincent Caruso tried to hold it together, calling meetings with the capos and underbosses, attempting to establish himself as the new Don. But the men who had sworn loyalty to Salvatore Moretti were not so eager to bow to his successor. They remembered Clara's words, they remembered the poison, and they wondered who among them could be trusted. Within a week, the first body turned up. A capo named Giuseppe Maroni, shot 3 times in the back of the head, his body dumped in an alley in Brooklyn. 2 days later, another soldier disappeared, his car found abandoned near the docks, blood on the seats, but no sign of the driver. The family was eating itself alive. Vivienne watched it all from a distance. She had left the city the night of the Christmas feast, taking a train to Philadelphia and then to Baltimore, moving from place to place like a ghost. She stayed in small hotels under false names, kept her head down and read the newspapers with a mixture of relief and dread. She had survived, but she had not escaped. Every night, she dreamed of the mansion, of the Don collapsing at the table, his face landing in the platter of fruit, of Clara's voice calm and cold, confessing to murder, of Vincent's gun pointed at Clara's chest, his hand trembling with rage. And every morning, she woke with the same question burning in her mind. Where was Clara Moretti? The newspapers had no answers. There were rumors, whispers passed from one criminal to another. Some said Clara had fled to Italy, to live out her days in a villa overlooking the Mediterranean. Others claimed she had gone to Canada, where she had family who would hide her. And still others insisted she had never left New York at all, that she was living in secret somewhere in the city, pulling strings from the shadows. But no one knew for certain. Clara Moretti had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Vivienne tried to move on. She found work as a secretary in a law office in Washington, D.C., using the name Clara Westfield and a fabricated history that no one thought to question. She rented a small apartment near DuPont Circle, furnished it with second-hand furniture, and tried to build a life that had nothing to do with Mafia feuds or poisoned wine, but the past would not let her go. It came for her on a cold evening in late January, in the form of a letter slipped under her apartment door. Vivienne found it when she came home from work, a plain white envelope with no return address and no stamp, just her false name written in elegant script across the front. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it, written in the same elegant hand, were 4 words. Meet me at midnight. Below the words was an address, a church in Georgetown, St. Agnes, and at the bottom, a signature, C. Vivienne's breath caught in her throat. Clara. It had to be. She considered ignoring the letter, burning it and pretending it had never arrived. She had spent weeks trying to leave the past behind, to bury the memories of the mansion and the blood feast and the life she had lost. Meeting Clara would only drag her back into the darkness, but she also knew she could not ignore it, because as much as she wanted to move on, as much as she wanted to forget, there were questions that only Clara could answer. And so at 11:30 that night, Vivienne put on her coat and walked through the snowy streets of Georgetown to St. Agnes Church. The church was small and old, its stone walls dark with age. A single light burned above the door, casting long shadows across the steps. Vivienne pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The interior was silent and cold, lit only by candles flickering in their holders along the walls. The pews were empty, the air thick with the smell of incense and old wood. Vivienne walked slowly down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the vastness. At the front of the church, kneeling before the altar, was a woman in a dark coat and veil. She did not turn as Vivienne approached, but her voice, soft and familiar, drifted through the silence. You came. I was not certain you would. Vivienne stopped a few feet behind her. Clara. Clara Moretti rose and turned to face her, lifting her veil. Her face was thinner than Vivienne remembered, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but there was a lightness in her expression, a sense of peace that had not been there before. Miss Ashford, Clara said with a faint smile. Or should I say Miss Westfield? You have adapted well to your new life. As have you, it seems, Vivienne replied. The papers say you vanished, that no one knows where you went. Clara's smile widened. The papers are correct. I am a ghost now, a name without a body, And that is exactly what I wanted. Why? Vivienne asked, her voice rising. Why did you confess? You could have let them suspect me. You could have escaped without taking the blame. Clara walked down the aisle and sat in one of the pews, gesturing for Vivienne to join her. I confessed because it was the only way to destroy the family. If I had let them blame you, they would have killed you and moved on. But by taking responsibility, by making them choose between justice and survival, I forced them to fracture, to turn on each other, to tear themselves apart. And it worked, Vivienne said quietly. The Moretti family is collapsing. Clara nodded. Yes, it is. And soon there will be nothing left. No empire, no power, just men fighting over scraps. She turned to Vivienne, her eyes serious. But that is not why I asked you to come. I asked you here because I owe you the truth about that night. About what really happened. Vivienne frowned. What do you mean? Clara reached into her coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which she handed to Vivienne. Read this. Vivienne unfolded the paper. It was a letter, written in a shaky hand. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have done what I could not. You have freed yourself from the man who destroyed our family. I want you to know that I do not blame you for what you did. I never blamed you. Marco's death was not your fault. It was mine. I was the one who tried to leave the family. I was the one who defied Salvatore, and I was the one who paid the price. But you should also know the truth. Marco is not dead. He is alive. I sent him away the night Salvatore gave the order. I paid a soldier to smuggle him out of the city, to take him to a place where Salvatore's reach could not find him. I told Salvatore that Marco had been dealt with, and he believed me, because I was his most loyal consigliere, and because he never suspected I would betray him. Marco is in California now, living under a new name. He does not know what happened, and he must never know. Let him believe I am dead. Let him believe you are dead. Let him live a life free of the shadows that consumed us. I am sorry for the burden I have placed on you, Clara, but I could not leave this world without telling you the truth. Marco is safe, and that is all that matters. Your brother in spirit, Antonio Ricci. Vivienne looked up, her hands trembling. Ricci, the consigliere. He saved your son. Clara's eyes glistened with tears. Yes, Antonio was the only man in that family who had any honor. He risked everything to save Marco, and he paid for it with his life. What happened to him? Clara's voice grew cold. Vincent Caruso killed him. 2 days after the feast. He suspected Antonio of betraying the family, and he was right. But Antonio died without speaking, without giving up Marco's location, and now my son is free. Vivienne felt a lump rise in her throat. That is why you confessed. Not just to destroy the family, but to protect Marco. Clara nodded. If the family had survived, they would have kept searching for him. They would have found him eventually. But now, with the family tearing itself apart, they have no resources to hunt him, no organization to track him down. Marco is safe, and that is all I ever wanted. Vivienne reached out and took Clara's hand. You sacrificed everything for him. Clara squeezed her hand, a sad smile crossing her face, as any mother would. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the past settling over them like a shroud. Then Clara spoke again, her voice soft. There is one more thing I need to tell you, Miss Ashford. About the poison. Vivienne looked up sharply. What about it? Clara's expression grew distant. The poison I gave you was real, deadly. It should have killed Salvatore within minutes, but it did not. Do you know why? Vivienne shook her head. Because Salvatore Moretti had been poisoning himself for years. Small doses of oleander mixed into his wine. He believed it would make him immune to assassination attempts, and he was right. The poison you poured into his glass was not enough to kill him, not on its own. Then how did he die? Vivienne whispered. Clara's smile was cold and bitter. Because I gave him a second dose. Before the feast, I poisoned his wineglass earlier in the evening, knowing he would drink from it before the meal began. The poison you added only ensured that his death would be public, witnessed by all his men, so that no one could claim it was natural causes. Vivienne stared at her, shock and awe warring in her chest. You planned it all, every detail. I had 5 years to plan, Clara said quietly. 5 years to think about how I would destroy the man who killed my son, or so I believed. And when the opportunity came, I took it. Vivienne felt a chill run through her. You used me. Clara met her gaze, her expression unapologetic. Yes, I used you. Just as Salvatore used you. Just as your father used you. We all use each other, Miss Ashford. That is the nature of this world. And what now? Vivienne asked, her voice trembling. What happens to us? Clara rose from the pew and pulled her veil back over her face. Now we disappear. You will continue your life as Clara Westfield. And I will vanish into the shadows. We will never see each other again, and in time, we will become nothing more than stories, ghosts of a world that no longer exists. She turned to leave, but Vivienne's voice stopped her. Wait, where will you go? Clara paused at the door, her silhouette framed by the candlelight. Somewhere far from here, somewhere Salvatore's ghost cannot follow. And then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. Vivienne sat alone in the church for a long time, her mind spinning. She thought about Clara Moretti, the woman who had orchestrated the death of one of the most powerful men in New York. She thought about Marco, the son who would never know the lengths his mother had gone to save him. She thought about Antonio Ricci, the consigliere who had given his life to protect a boy he believed deserved a future. And she thought about herself, Vivienne Ashford, the heiress who had sold her fortune, betrayed her father's associates and helped murder a Mafia don. What had she become? The answer, she realized, did not matter, because the woman she had been no longer existed. Vivienne Ashford had died the night her father's telegram arrived, and in her place stood someone else, someone harder, someone who had learned that survival required sacrifice and that freedom came with a cost. She rose from the pew and walked out of the church into the cold night air. Snow was falling, soft and silent, blanketing the streets in white. Vivienne pulled her coat tighter and began to walk, her footsteps disappearing into the snow. She did not know where she was going, only that she could not stay. The months that followed were a blur. Vivienne left Washington and traveled west, moving from city to city, never staying long enough to put down roots. She worked odd jobs, saved her money and kept to herself. She read the newspapers when she could, following the slow disintegration of the Moretti family. Vincent Caruso was found dead in March, shot in his own home by men he had once called brothers. The capos turned on each other, fighting over territory and influence. By summer, the Moretti organization had fractured into a dozen smaller gangs, each one weaker than the whole, and through it all, there was no word of Clara Moretti. In the fall of 1931, Vivienne found herself in San Francisco, standing on the edge of the Pacific Ocean. The water stretched out before her, endless and gray, and she thought about how far she had come, from the ballrooms of New York to the alleyways of the underworld, from heiress to accomplice to ghost. She had survived, but she had lost everything, or had she? One evening, as she walked along the waterfront, a man approached her. He was young, perhaps 20, with dark hair and kind eyes. He wore a simple suit and carried a medical bag. "Excuse me," he said, his voice polite. "I am looking for the Harborview Clinic. Do you know where it is?" Vivienne pointed down the street. 2 blocks that way, on the corner. The young man smiled. "Thank you. Are you from around here?" "No," Vivienne said. "Just passing through." The young man nodded. "Me too. I am starting a residency at the clinic. I just moved here from Los Angeles." Something in his voice made Vivienne pause. "Los Angeles?" "Yes," the young man said. "Well, originally from New York, but I have been in California for a few years now." Vivienne's heart skipped a beat. "What is your name?" The young man hesitated, then smiled. "Marcus. Marcus West." Vivienne stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. Marco, Clara's son, alive, safe, standing before her, unaware of the blood and sacrifice that had bought his freedom. "It is nice to meet you, Marcus," Vivienne said quietly. "Likewise," Marcus replied. "And your name?" Vivienne hesitated. Then she smiled. "Clara." "My name is Clara." Marcus tipped his hat. "Well, Miss Clara, thank you for the directions. Perhaps I will see you around." "Perhaps," Vivienne said. She watched him walk away, disappearing into the crowd, and felt something break inside her. Not pain, not grief, but something closer to peace. Marco Moretti was alive. He was free. And he would never know the cost of that freedom. Vivienne turned back to the ocean, the wind whipping her hair around her face. She had come to San Francisco with no plan, no purpose, no future. But now she understood. This was where her story ended. Not in violence, not in revenge, but in the quiet knowledge that some battles are won, not by fighting, but by letting go. She walked away from the waterfront, her footsteps light, her heart unburdened for the first time in months. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time since her father's death, she did not need to. The heiress who sold her fortune to free her family from the Mafia had vanished in the winter of 1931, and in her place stood a woman with no name, no past, and no ties to the world she had left behind. A ghost, a shadow, a memory. And somewhere in the cold December night, Clara Moretti smiled, knowing her son was safe, and that the empire she had destroyed would never rise again. The end.